Exclusively on Secular Media Network, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.
Coming to you on Secular Media Network, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto, your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. I'm your host, Callie Wright, and today we're talking about death and dealing with death from an atheist perspective. My guest, Greta Christina, is the author of the new book, Comforting Thoughts About Death That Have Nothing to Do with God. It's a good book, and I highly recommend it. It's a quick read, but it's got lots of great insights as to how we as non-believers deal with death and dying, and makes a pretty strong case that, conversely to what many atheists believe, and I used to be one of them, that religion doesn't offer better comfort to the grieving. Greta Christina is author of Coming Out Atheist, How to Do It, How to Help Each Other, and Why, of Why Are You Atheists So Angry, 99 Things That Piss Off the Godless, and of Bending, dirty, kinky stories about pain, power, religion, unicorns, and more. She blogs at Greta Christina's blog, which I will link in the show notes, one of the most widely read and well-respected blogs in the atheist blogosphere, and is a regular contributor to Alternet, Salon, Free Inquiry, and The Humanist. And Greta joins me on the show today. All right, Greta Christina, welcome to the Gaytheist Manifesto.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the book is Comforting Thoughts About Death That Have Nothing to Do with God. If I can ask, was there a personal experience that led you to write this, or did it just seem like there was a general need, or what started that whole thing?
Well, something of both. The original essay that I wrote several years ago, titled Comforting Thoughts About Death That Have Nothing to Do with God, was an essay I wrote for Skeptical Inquirer. It was actually the first piece of non-theistic writing that I'd ever done. And that I wrote because I had had surgery, and it was really minor surgery. It was not a big deal. I just broke my arm and needed a pin set in it. But I needed general anesthetic. And I don't know if you've ever had general anesthetic. By the way, I promise this isn't a tangent. This really is relevant.
It's okay.
If you've ever had general anesthetic, you know that it's not like falling asleep. It's like just not existing. You know, basically, I came out of this anesthetic. I'd been out for a couple of hours, but I had no sense of time having passed. If you'd told me that I'd been gone for a week or a month or a year, I would have believed you. And I realized I'd already been beginning to question my religious and supernatural beliefs. But that was kind of the final nail in the coffin. I realized that if just a small amount of a chemical in my brain could obliterate my consciousness to that degree, could just make me essentially not exist to that degree, what made me think that my consciousness could survive my brain actually being dead and rotting into dust in the ground? And that was a very difficult experience for me. And this was several years ago, and I wasn't aware of any sort of atheist or humanist community. I wasn't aware of atheist and humanist writings on death and dying. And I kind of had to go through that experience alone. You know, I had to deal with the acceptance of my actual mortality, the acceptance of the fact that I really am going to die. And when I die, that's it. You know, I'm not going to exist anymore. I had to deal with that alone, and it was very difficult and very traumatic. And I didn't want anybody else to have to do that. I didn't want anybody else to have to go through that alone. So I wrote that essay with that in mind. And many of the other writings that I did for this book, it was the same thing. It was just like, I know that death can be one of the most difficult parts of accepting that there is no God, accepting that there is no afterlife. And I wanted to, and as time went on, I gained more peace and more acceptance of the reality and the finality of death. And I wanted to share that with other people so nobody else had to go through it.
That's awesome. See, I am and I feel like I'm the only one sometimes, of atheists who I will freely admit that the idea of death kind of terrifies me. And I know that that's illogical because, I mean, I know the facts about, when you die, you cease to exist. You're not there to suffer it. But for some reason, that doesn't stop me. And I don't know if that's cultural programming. I don't know exactly what that is. But, and it's not something that I, have to work through day to day or anything like that. It's just like when I really get to thinking about it. So was that, did you go through a stage of that before you got to the other side?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to say that I got to the other side. I think death is difficult, and I think it's actually entirely logical that death is difficult and that death is terrifying. I mean, for one thing, if we look at it from a purely evolutionary standpoint, we evolved from billions of generations of animals who really didn't want to die. It's the fact of wanting to be alive, wanting to not die, being frightened of death, being averse to death. It's entirely natural. It makes perfect sense. If we had ancestors who were perfectly fine with dying, we probably wouldn't be here. And life is valuable, more than just sort of this biological drive to live. Life is valuable, and I think it makes sense to be frightened of it, to be frightened of death, to be upset by the idea of death. And in particular, it makes sense to grieve when people we love are dead and we're not going to see them again. So I think that coming to an acceptance of death without religion, it doesn't mean that we never are frightened. It doesn't mean that we're never upset about it. It doesn't mean that we don't grieve. It doesn't mean that we're angry about it. What it means, at least for me, is that I have some foundation of philosophy that gets me through that fear, that gets me through that anxiety, that gets me through those moments of extreme grief, and makes me feel like, okay, I know that this is upsetting, but on the other side of it, life is valuable, life is still worth living, life is extremely precious, and I want to engage with it as much as I possibly can while I'm here. So it's not that I'm not frightened of death. It's just that I feel like I have better tools to cope with that fear, having spent several years thinking this through, talking it through with other non-believers. And it is, again, those tools that I'm hoping to share with other people. And honestly, one of those tools is accepting the reality that, yes, of course, death is upsetting, and that's okay.
Right. Yeah, I see this bravado so many times when this conversation comes up, and like, I'm not afraid to die. I don't care, blah, blah, blah. And I just think to myself, like, I don't want to, pretend that I'm in someone else's head. I just think, like, are you really being honest with yourself about that? Like, I don't know.
I think people of whether believers, non-believers, everybody, we have very different ways of dealing with death. And I do, I've talked with a lot of non-believers who do say, yeah, I'm not afraid of being dead. I'm not afraid of dying. I like to live. I like to be alive, and I treasure life. And I've talked with enough of them that I do believe them, although I think that may change as their life goes on. And it may not change, and it may also be that some people who are more frightened of death will gain more peace. I think that the way we deal with death is very different. It's very personal. And the way we deal with our own mortality and the way we deal with the mortality of people that we love. And that's something that, when I was younger and wrestling with death, a lot of what I was wrestling with was my own mortality. I don't want to die. As I got older and more people that I knew started dying, when, my father died a few years ago, and that was the stimulus, the motivation to do some of the writing that I did in this book. Dealing with our own mortality and dealing with the grief of people who we love who are dead, those are kind of different issues. They're related, obviously. And I think that some of these people who are saying, yeah, I'm not afraid of death, I mean, if that's really legitimately true, I believe them. I'm not going to, question, question that. But I do think that, these people do still have to deal with grief. Even if they accept their own mortality, they still have to find a way to accept the mortality and the death of people they love.
Yeah.
And that is difficult. And if people are legitimately like, I'm not afraid of death, then more power to them, But this book is written for people for whom that's not true, or people who, even if they've accepted their own mortality, are still struggling to accept the mortality of the other people in their life.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's talk for a second about the argument that religion is better comfort for people about their own mortality and about the mortality of people that they love. Because I'll be honest, I was pretty firmly in that camp until I read the book, and now I'm not so sure. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, one of the points that I make in the book is that there's a lot of atheists who, there's a lot of people, religious believers and even some atheists, who say one of their arguments for religion is not that religion is true, not that religion is, not like they're not providing any evidence that religion is real. What they say is religion is comforting, that in the face of death and grief and the face of our own mortality, religion provides comfort. And even a lot of atheists accept that. They say, atheism has a lot to offer, including being true, which is a lot. But that, when it comes to death, religion has a speed. Absolutely, it would be better to, we'd be happier, we'd be more comforted if religious views of death were true. And I don't think that's true. What I think is that religious views of death are only comforting when we don't think about them very carefully. I think that that when you start really examining religious views of death, they kind of fall apart. And that in itself is not very comforting. And I think the classic example is the classic Christian notions of heaven, that, when you die, you're going to live forever in perfect bliss. Everybody you ever loved is going to be there with you, also in perfect bliss. There's not going to be any problems, no upset, no fear, no anger, nothing. Everything will be awesome. And that's really only comforting if you don't think about it very carefully. I mean, think about essentially a lot of what makes us who we are is conflict. A lot of what makes us who we are and what makes our relationships with other people what they are is conflict. And, the idea of a heaven where there's no conflict, either it's not true and there is conflict in heaven, in which case it's not perfect bliss. It's not that different from life here on earth. Or we have become so different that we essentially are not who we are. I think the same is true of when I imagine heaven, I imagine it being unspeakably tedious. Just doing this one thing, just singing God's praises for literally eternity. It just sounds really boring. And again, in order for it to not be boring, I would have to be such a different person from who I am that I would essentially not be who I am. And so it's, there's some afterlife for somebody, but it's not me. And when I look at lots of different views of the afterlife, reincarnation, for instance, this idea that I'm going to be reincarnated and somehow it's still me, even though I have no memory of these past lives that I've had. Well, a huge amount of what makes me who I am is my memories. Arguably that's all of who I am. And certainly it's a huge amount of who I am. And so what does it even mean to still exist, air quotes exist, if I don't have my memories? It's the same thing. It's not really me. And so essentially all of these religious views of death, they don't really make sense. It's not just that they're implausible in the sense that they're probably not true. It's that they're just not even internally consistent. And I know from my own experience, when I did have supernatural spiritual beliefs, I got some degree of comfort from those beliefs when I was contemplating my own mortality and when I was contemplating the death of people that I had loved. But I couldn't really think about this view very carefully. I'd sort of go, oh yeah, but it's okay because we're all going to live forever somehow magically. And I couldn't really meditate on it. I couldn't really examine it because I knew in the back of my mind that I didn't really have a very good reason to think this, that this was just essentially wishful thinking. And that's not very comforting. And what I found is that my naturalist, my humanist views, my skeptical views of death, they're not as comforting on the surface, but they provide more richness, they provide more depth, and it's a more solid foundation, because when I am struggling with fear or grief about death, I can really examine them, I can really contemplate them, and they're a solid foundation in a way that my supernatural beliefs never were. So I do think that atheists have a tendency to not talk very much about death because religions won that battle, right? And I don't think we should do that. I don't think we should concede that ground. I think that our views of death are better simply because the fact that they are true and that they are more substantiated, that in itself is actually a source of comfort that I think we often don't give enough credit to.
And speaking of the word comfort, because one of the things that did it for me was where you talk about how, when you say that this thing gives me comfort, that doesn't mean that it doesn't, that it makes it not suck. And I don't know, for some reason, I guess I never put two and two together because I'd had that thought before about how, seeing, someone close to me who's, getting up there in age, seeing her very obviously struggle with her mortality, even as a fundamentalist Christian, I'm thinking to myself, what are you afraid of? Like, if you honestly believe, that where you're going afterwards is so awesome, why are you not in a hurry? Or, when you see devoutly religious people just as devastated by the loss of loved ones as any atheist is, I had asked those questions before, but I guess for some reason I never put two and two together. So I think it's important to, to point out that idea that comfort doesn't equal not suffering.
Yes, exactly. And, exactly what you said. It's, I think atheists, we think, oh, well, our philosophies don't really provide substantial comfort because, hey, we're still grieved when people we love die, and we still are afraid of death, or at least some of us are still afraid of death. And I think it is important to remember that religious believers, they go through exactly the same thing. They still don't want to die. They still put off death for as long as they can, most of the time. They still grieve terribly and are devastated, as you say, when people they love die. And so I think it's important to remember that comfort doesn't mean eradicating all bad feelings. It means that it alleviates some of the bad feelings. It makes the bad feelings, the upsetting feelings, the fear, the anxiety, the grief, it makes it more tolerable. It makes it more manageable. It gives you a sense that even when you're really gripped with the worst of it, that there's a place on the other side, that it's like a life preserver is a image that I sometimes use. And that's true of atheists and believers. So I think that we don't need to say, oh, well, religion has this covered because religion somehow magically eradicates the fear of death. It doesn't.
Yeah, and so to stray away from directly the topic of the book for a second, something that I'd love to get your perspective on is in the LGBT community, I think grief is something that we're maybe a little more acquainted with than the rest of general society, in that, we're more experienced we're more likely to experience violence or, be killed for who we are and that kind of thing. And something that I'm going through at the moment is I'm on the planning committee for my city's Transgender Day of Remembrance. Are you familiar with TDOR?
Yes.
Okay. So there's a lot of religion in the ceremony as it stands. And there are basically two atheists in the room saying, hey, that doesn't represent all of us. So, I don't know, I guess your thoughts on how to tactfully walk that line, because obviously I don't want to begrudge people who need that form of comfort if that's what they believe in. But I also don't want the people in the room who aren't believers to feel like they're forgotten about and not represented too.
I think that is hugely important, and it is a big issue. It's interesting that you mention, and you're talking about violence and violence and murder and and so on. I agree, actually, that the LGBT community has had more than its share of death and grief, and some of it is violence. And honestly, I'm 53 years old, and so a lot of what that means to me is HIV. I went through the really bad years, the years when people were just dying like flies and there was nothing that anybody could do about it. And I do think that, there's a lot of, and HIV does still kill people. I think we tend to talk about that. And as you say, many of us are more likely to be targeted with violence, transgender people especially. So as far as how to approach that in a community way, I do think that it is. I mean, I'm not necessarily the best person to ask about tact because that's not
fair enough.
But I think that a way to approach it is in the LGBT community. Often we are pretty good about diversity. We're not as good as we should be, but we are better, I think, about it than a lot of other communities because we've kind of been forced to really deal with it. And certainly on an organizational level, a lot of LGBT organizations, at least in theory, at least in principle, are like, yes, we want to be diverse. We want to be welcoming to people of all races and genders and gender identities and so on. And I think that a way that atheists can present that is to put that into the mix, to say, look, we are another marginalized identity within, LGBT, being LGBT. And if you want, you can point them to statistics. LGBT people are more likely to be non-religious than the general population by far. Something like half of us are not religious. And not religious doesn't necessarily mean not having any, supernatural or spiritual beliefs, but we don't believe at a much higher rate. And I think it's important to remind people of that and to say, and I think a way, if you're trying to be tactful, is to say, look, we don't want you to not speak to speak what is true for you. We don't want you to not talk about religion if that's true for you. But you need to remember that when you say that, when you talk about whatever you're talking about a next life or whatever, you need to remember that probably about half the people in the room don't feel that way, don't believe that, and are feeling shut out. So make sure that you're speaking just about your own experience. Don't talk about religion in a way that assumes that you're speaking for the entire room or the entire crowd. And make sure that you get humanist, atheist, representatives. If you're doing a day of remembrance, make sure that you get some people speaking who aren't coming at this from a religious perspective, because otherwise you're going to have a whole lot of people in that crowd who are like, I came to this event to share this experience of grief and anger, and I felt shut out. I felt like this wasn't about me. I felt like this was about everybody else, but this wasn't about me. So I think if we frame it in those terms of inclusivity and sometimes, it's interesting. A lot of religious believers just don't remember that not everybody's religious. Religion is so pervasive in our culture, even in the LGBT community. And I think we have to remember, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's actually relevant. I think we have to remember that the LGBT or organized LGBT, LGBT organizations and structures and so on didn't always used to be this religious. This was a deliberate effort. Making religion a big part of LGBT culture was a deliberate effort on the part of people who are trying to make LGBT community more mainstream. It was a deliberate effort to try to make us seem like we're just like straight people. And if people are resisting that, if they're resisting the white picket fencing of LGBT community, I think we need to remember that part of that is acknowledging, yes, some of us are religious and a whole lot of us are not. And if you're trying to present us as religious because, hey, we're as an effort to make us seem we're just like everybody else, you know what? We're not just like everybody else. And there are ways in which we are, and we're all human and so on. But, there's huge diversity in our community. And I think that trans people, I'm sure, have the experience of being thrown under the bus because, we're trying to
constantly.
Just like everybody else is gender normative. And I think if you put atheism and non-belief in that same framework as like, look, we're tired of being thrown under the bus too. And there are trans people and LGBT people who are non-religious. And, maybe I think maybe if we make analogies, if we say, let's say you were going to a Transgender Day of Remembrance, and the only thing anybody ever talked about was Jesus Christ, your personal Lord and Savior. Presumably they wouldn't do that because they understand that there are people who are Jewish, there are people who are Muslim, there are people who are Buddhist, there are people who are Wiccan, there are people who are Hindu, there are people who are spiritual but not religious and don't identify as Christians. Presumably they wouldn't spend the whole day talking about Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, who's going to take you up into heaven in the arms of our Lord. Well, even when you talk about religion in more general, vague terms, you're still cutting out anybody who doesn't believe in any religion, just the way that if you're talking about Jesus Christ, our personal Lord and Savior, you're cutting out everybody who's Jewish, Wiccan, Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, etc.
I hear that. Yeah, and I'm giving the keynote this year, and I'm trying to figure out how to walk that line because I don't want to seem like I'm proselytizing atheism, but I also want to make sure that people in the room know that I'm talking to them too. So
yeah, and as far as that goes, I think if you just say something that I was actually just at a memorial service. It was a 25th anniversary of this major event in AIDS activism, and so there was a memorial service for many of the AIDS activists who had died. And one of the things that the officiant, I guess officiant is the word, did was she acknowledged there are some people in this room who have religious beliefs. There are some people who aren't, and she said, for those of you who are religious, XYZ, for those of you who aren't, ABC, and she would say, it's like, we're going to do a ritual now together. We're going to do some sort of group ritual. And if you're religious, it might mean this. If you're not religious, it might mean this. And just that acknowledgement that this is for all of us. Sometimes I think that's, again, religious believers just need that reminder that, oh God, that's right. Not everybody believes, some people, even if they've left religion, it doesn't just mean, I'm spiritual but not religious. Some of us aren't even spiritual, and that's okay. So yeah, I think that there are ways. And actually, when we're done here, I can put you in touch with the woman who did that celebrant was Rebecca Hensler, and she's the founder of Grief Beyond Belief, which if people listening to this aren't familiar with, Grief Beyond Belief is an online support network for people who don't have religion who are grieving, because a whole lot of grief support is religious or includes religion in it, or includes spirituality or the supernatural in it, even if it's not formal religion. And she, needed a support network for her and for other people who are grieving and want support without anybody telling them, it's okay because you'll see them on the other side and they're in a better place and everything happens for a reason and so on. So her name again is Rebecca Hensler. Grief Beyond Belief is the organization. They have a Facebook group and they also have a website with resources. And when we're done here, I'll put you in touch with her because she might have some good words for you about how to do a memorial in a way that is genuinely inclusive.
That's awesome. And actually, yeah, that's kind of what I was going to segue into next is talking about sort of practical things. So, so far we've talked about the arguments and the thinking and all that kind of stuff. So, for me, part of my story is that I'm 30 years old and I've managed to go without losing someone who I was very, very close to my entire life so far, which makes me like a unicorn. Like, I'm not aware of anyone that I know who's gone that long without losing, a parent, a friend, close family member, anything like that. So, in terms of practical steps, when this kind of when this kind of thing happens, when you lose someone that's close to you, or even, you know, dealing with your own mortality, what sorts of things work in that area that you've noticed or you've seen?
That's a very large question, obviously.
Right.
The first thing I want to say is this book, Comforting Thoughts About Death That Have Nothing to Do with God, I want to be honest here and let the listeners know this book isn't really about that. This book is not a grief guide. It's not like a grief workbook or anything like that. It's more about philosophy. It's more about, here are ways of looking at death, of looking at mortality, that can make it easier to manage. But it's not a practical grief guide. I might write that book at some point, but that's not what this is. But that being said, I think one of the most important things to remember when you are grieving is that everybody does it differently, and that there's not really like one right way to do it. There are some people who, for instance, throw themselves into their work. There are some people who need to take a break from work if they can, or from dealing with life, as much as they can. They need to sort of step back. There are some people who cry a lot. There's some people who sort of find refuge in morbid humor. Different people really deal with it differently, and different people deal with it differently at different stages in the process. One of the first things I'll say is throw Elizabeth Kubler-Ross out the window. That whole thing about the 5 stages of death, of grief, the 5 stages of dealing with mortality, it's crap. It's been debunked. There's not these 5 stages that happen in this order, and once you get to acceptance, you're done. That's not the way it is. Everybody does it differently. People do it go through different stages of it, air quote stages, at different times. And I think one of the things that's most useful is getting support. And it's one of the reasons why I think Grief Beyond Belief is so important, is talking with other people who are grieving. That can really help get a reality check. It's like, because I know when my father died a few years ago, I went through some experiences that I thought, like, am I literally having mental health problems? And I actually do have mental health problems. I have depression. But I was like, am I having some mental health problems apart from depression that I need to get taken care of, because I feel like I'm literally losing my mind here? And I would talk with other grieving people, and they'd say, no, I went through the same thing, or I'm going through the same thing. That's really familiar. Just having that sort of, that reflection of your reality can make a big difference. So support makes a big difference. And I think, this may sound callous, and I don't mean it that way. I mean it exactly the opposite. For me, one of the things that made grief more manageable was just accepting this is going to suck. This is just going to suck. There's no way that it's not going to suck. It's just going to suck until it stops sucking, or until it sucks less. And it's, for me, one of the things that when I was intensely grieving my father, one of the ways that I experienced that grief was feeling this constant restlessness, this constant, no matter what I was doing, I wanted to be doing something else. It's like if I was traveling, like when I was, flying across the country to see my brother and be with my family after my father had died. I was like so uncomfortable, and I was like, in the car to the airport, and I was on the plane, and I was in the taxi to home, and I was like, oh, okay, as soon as I get there, I'll be okay. And as soon as I can rest, I'll be okay. And then I'd be resting. I'd be, I was where I was, traveling to, and I'd be sitting still, and I'd be, okay, I can't stand sitting still. I have to get up and I have to do something. And I realized that restlessness was itself part of the grief, that I just had this sense that something is wrong, something has to be fixed. And of course, what was wrong was that my father was dead. and that I was not going to get him back. And just sort of recognizing that and accepting, oh, this is just going to be hard. And I just have to sit with that and let it be. I mean, that's extremely difficult, but at the same time, it was comforting to me to recognize there's nothing wrong with me. I'm not, losing my mind. I'm not, doing this wrong. This is just really hard. This is the death of people we love is one of the hardest things that we have to deal with as human beings, arguably the hardest thing we have to deal with as human beings. And just accepting that, yes, this is hard and we just have to go through it can be very reassuring.
Awesome. Well, the book is Comforting Thoughts About Death That Have Nothing to Do with God. Greta, tell us where we can find it.
The book is available in print and in ebook and in audiobook. The print edition is available at Amazon and Powell's and lots of different places. If your local bookstore doesn't have it, they can order it. If your library doesn't have it, they can order it. The ebook is available at all the usual places, Kindle and Nook and Smashwords. The audiobook is available in, on Audible and Amazon and, iTunes and the usual places. So yeah, it's out there. If your bookstore doesn't carry it, ask them to carry it. You can special order it. So yeah, you can pretty much get it anywhere you get books, you can get this book.
Awesome. And I will throw some links in the show notes. Greta, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you are so welcome. Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto on Secular Media Network. I want to say thank you again to my guest, Greta Christina. You can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto. You can email us at thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter at Gaytheist Callie, and you can find the show on Twitter at The Gaytheists. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, and knows that you're capable of amazing things and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.